Ave Maria.
Frank Wright is a Catholic writer living in Hampshire with his wife and 2 young children. Frank writes about the impact of the loss of God on Western civilization, with a particular focus on the third religion of man, namely liberalism. Frank is currently working on 2 books. One is concerned with the origins, development, and futures of the rainbow movement. The other treats of the dehumanizing process of technological managerialism, a political technique which is refining what can best be described as repatterning human beings as machines. Frank is going to speak on the real war on the family as it is now escalating. Where did it come from? Where is it now? And where is it going? He will share with us the ideas which form the anti-natalist and anti-family ideology that is shaping a post-human future, a future without God, with humanity repatterned on the technology intended to replace him. So would you please give a warm welcome to Frank Wright.
I went to the Life Site do in Canada earlier this year, because I write for Life Site sometimes. And quite a lot of them came up to me and had this name tag on. And I'm like, oh, hi, Frank. I thought you were taller. I thought you were bigger in real life. You know, I thought, well, I'm sorry to disappoint you. You know, so I'm used to this height-related bigotry, and I expected that. Today, I'm going to talk to you about the origins of the war on the family, that there is a war on the family, where it comes from, where we are, and what its aims are, and what the basis is. What's the origins of this weird, international, anti-natalist elite movement that seems to dominate everything at the highest level of political economy? Before I do that, I want to answer the first basic question of what, in the Army Reserve, the infantry. So they talk about war a lot, right? Most interesting question about war, if you're in one, is can we win? And if, you know, obviously what I want to say to you is, I don't want to bring you a message of hope, but one of victory. The reason why we are going to win, and we are going to win, will be made clear as I go through the provenance of this death cult that we inhabit. I will show you how inherently unstable it is, and I will demonstrate the fact that you live in the time of its universal collapse. Politically, diplomatically, economically, morally, practically, nationally, socially, it is falling apart before your eyes. And I'll show you why that's the case. Because its ideological architecture is based upon fantasy, a utopianism that began in the Enlightenment. So what I'm going to go on about, briefly, if I can, despite my extensive notes, and do please throw a tomato if you can hit the target this small. Yeah. Yeah, I always say that to the tall of the infantry. Yeah, it's easier to shoot you, isn't it, big boy? Why do you think I'm not dead? Anyway, so if you can get me, get me. Yeah, I have no feelings anymore, having 2 small children, a wife and a mother-in-law at home. So you can't hurt me. But yeah, what I'm going to do is I'll tell you about briefly about the ideas of the Enlightenment that led to liberalism, the cult of the self, and how this has been transformed in the 20th century through technology and mass society, and how those processes and the confluence of those processes leads towards what can only be described as a post-human future, where you see characters like Yuval Noah Harari, who isn't a scientist, platformed by the World Economic Forum to talk about the synergy of bodies and machines, who called Christ himself fake news. Yuval Noah Harari said our Lord and Savior was fake news. And he said this while he was smiling. And the reason for this is because these people are expressly addicted to the notion that technology confers upon them the power of God, that it is a replacement for God. So the moral confusion that you are seeing collapsing around you in universal disorder, and I would stress barbarism and a license for genocide. A license for genocide is being normalized, and it has been normalized throughout the period, especially the accelerating period of post-Soviet liberalism. Why is this collapsing now? Why do we have people who are stressing that it is important not to have children, that it is a pinnacle of human rights and emancipation to murder them before they are born? And an answer to social problems in some of the liberal nations of the West is to assist you in killing yourself. Why? Why do we inhabit a culture of death? And why is it falling apart? And why should that give you not just hope, but certainty of victory? And I'll explain to you why right now. And if I go on too much, there's always a chair, you know. So look, the war of the family is real, as I'm sure you're aware. Broadly speaking, it comes from the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was, in German, it means the Aufklärung, which means the explanation. This was the attempt to remove, as it were, the superstition of religion with the human power of reason. The idea that the world could be rendered entirely rational was championed by speakers such as Auguste Comte, who was a champion of the French Revolution. And he said that once the revolution had been established and truth had been arrived at, free speech could be abolished. These people are utopianists. The thing to understand here is that once man deliberately decided to replace God with himself and his own reason, he replaced any broader moral framework than his own personal desires and his reflections. And this has directly led to the preference or hedonic utilitarianism today of people like Peter Singer, which underpins the legal arguments for the use of technology to end life at its beginning and its end. You're probably familiar with Peter Singer's work, but I would stress once again that the moral foundation of his reasoning is preference, which he now calls hedonic utilitarianism. This means that it is morally just to take any action that confers upon you pleasure or personal advantage. And it is also correct and wise to avoid any decision that places you at a personal disadvantage or that displeases you personally. And this is an argument that is being universalized and totalized, because people forget that liberalism is a totalizing system. One of the reasons why I'm going to talk about international politics now is because you must understand the wider framework in which this war on the family is taking place. And I mentioned the word death cult before. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, we have inhabited the American empire in the Anglosphere, what people generally call the West. We are satellites of the United States, and we are basically servants of its foreign and domestic policies. And we inhabit its moral and its economic paradigm. This economic paradigm is based upon the idea of regime change, which was introduced in 1990, following a Rand Corporation strategy paper that said the United States could now follow one of four paths following the unanticipated fall of the Soviet Union. No intelligence expert predicted that. They had four options. Three of them would have conferred a peace dividend. You never hear about that anymore, do you? They chose the path that said only global power. This meant that the United States would escalate and not reduce its military spending. It would continue the programs that it set up to destabilize the countries of the Soviet Union, the satellite states of the Russian Empire. And it would continue to do this in the absence of that enemy to countries that it then designated as enemies. This means the entire economy of the West was in part interdigitated with an enormous war machine that is a death machine, and that is interdigitated with the liberal idea of death that has been socialized as personal emancipation. This war machine has cost the United States alone $9 trillion since the year 2000, and it continues to this day. That is the moral framework in which the war on the family takes place, where the liberal idea, being the verdict of history, as according to Francis Fukuyama, is announced as the verdict of history, the end state of human advancement. We've arrived at the end of history, and what that means is some kind of elections plus cheap consumer goods is the pinnacle of human destiny. And because of this, a moral chauvinism appeared, which licensed the states of the West to do what they call liberal interventions, that is, to use military force and economic sanctions to starve and bomb people's nations. That is liberal chauvinism. That culture of death extends to our homes now, because the populations who've been transferred from those nations, and this is never pointed out in the mainstream media, have now come to our nations. And isn't it a surprise that if you go around destroying countries around the world to spread your democratic values, and we'll get to those values in a minute, that those people are going to flee that disorder and come to you? Regime change has come home. This is the chaos we inhabit today. We inhabit a political system that is deeply corrupt and absolutely criminal. It is based upon the export of death as a business, and it is re-importing that death in a universalized war on terror, which has simply been reignited in the past week. Why does this have anything to do with the war on the family? The reason this has to do with the war on the family is to show you that the political class, the distant elites that rule us, place absolutely no value on human life whatsoever. They are purely transactional. Transactional means it's a business model of life. Liberalism has led us into a consumer mentality of life where the whole of life is simply a bargain hunt. What can I get for me? What's in it for me? As you can see from the large-scale decriminalization and epidemic of crime, from shoplifting to rioting to violence, the best bargain you can get is to take things for yourself without paying for them. and to prefer yourself at all times. This is the moral system that has led women to first denounce the family as a prison, the marriage as some kind of death sentence, children as drudgery. And one of the most popular memes during the appalling lockdowns was one of a woman staring at her phone saying, "What? You mean I have to spend time with my own children now?" And that was a common joke amongst families that I knew. The idea that the family is a prison for women has been replaced by the only remaining facet of the former liberal pluralist settlement, which is the career. The pinnacle of this is the extermination of your own children as the supremacy of emancipation. There is no more sincere argument to demonstrate that the promises of negative liberty of liberalism have not resulted in liberation, but in annihilation. And the argument for abortion is proof positive that that is the destination of these utopian ideas which infuse a cult of the self that is indistinguishable from the work of Satan. The issue here is one of the self and its desires, counterpoint to the foundation of society, to the foundation of nations, and to the incubation of any sensible model for stability. That's the family. Why are they against the family, as it were? Why is there a war on the family? The family is a bulwark against all of the negative influences of the massification of culture. We live in a time where, through digital media and through mass consumerism, you can at times feel like you inhabit a Ballardian international nowhere land. You could be in Bangkok or Ulaanbaatar or Calgary. If you look at these glass edifices, there's no vernacular, there's no sense of place. It's a placeless existence. We live in nowhere. That is utopia. That is the result of utopian thinking. Your built environment reflects that. The fact that we are completely disconnected from reality is not accidental. The liberal idea relies upon the insistence of sheer fantasies in the place of reality. And that is the most profound reason that I can offer you in a secular manner alone as to why this war is going to be won, because reality has the best arguments. The reduction of life to mere consumption and to personal desire means the complete annihilation of everything else. The war on the family takes place in a far wider context of the complete annihilation of culture with the massification of everything. It doesn't matter whether you're left-wing, an agnostic, a Hindu, a believing Catholic. It doesn't matter if you're a Marxist, a revolutionary, or even a Nazi. They're going to wipe all of that out. It's the chicken ability that matters. The global culture, the global anti-natalist culture that is proposed for this post-human future is an anti-culture. And it doesn't matter what side of the political spectrum you're on, what your beliefs are, or what you personally think the world should be like. It is annihilating everything. Why does it annihilate everything? There are two questions of liberal freedom that Sir Isaiah Berlin put in his inaugural speech in 1958 as titular professor at Wolfson College, Oxford. His two ideas of liberty. So one is negative liberty, and that's the one that most people think about, the freedom from restraint. Basic liberal idea in the West is the idea that we should be free from restraint. The Enlightenment idea that our traditions, our customs, which are derived from Christianity, and which are, in many senses, literally Christianity, these are simply restraints upon my desires, and I must remove them in order to move into some model of emancipation that is never accurately described. Progress never has a stated destination. It never says where it's going. It's the going that matters. And the direction of travel is away from settled culture, from meaning, and the ultimate meaning, of course, is God. The war on the family is inspired by the cult of the self versus the supreme authority, which is the Lord himself. It is therefore a satanic attempt to continue Christianity without Christ through liberalism. The liberal idea itself has collapsed. It has collapsed into paradox, legally, morally, and practically. And I'll explain to you why. The problem of negative liberty is this, is that once you do delimit people completely, once there is no moral restraint, no cultural restraint, no religious restraint, and no customary restraint, People end up with the jaded appetites of the Marquis de Sade. They do not end up enlightened. They do not end up liberated. They do not end up as being very good ambassadors for their own lives. They end up addicted to drugs, legal and otherwise. They end up alone. They end up alcoholics. They end up miserable. They end up having white-hot moments of intense moral outrage about issues that they've seen on their phone today, but with absolutely no wider moral framework and no historical memory. And any attempt to remind them of the context of their outrage, or the fact that there might be some nuance to that, or indeed a legitimate grievance behind these outpourings of hatred that they denounce, because sometimes there are. This is met with calls of treason. The truth is treason nowadays. The truth is treason. And my personal experience in calling for peace instead of universalized vengeance has been to be called various bigoted names, basically a traitor. This is the madness we inhabit now. And staying sane relies upon the fact that you must look beyond yourself, as we do, to a higher spiritual purpose in life than the getting of my own desires and the display of my own temporary virtue. Negative liberty leads people into annihilation, not liberation. You exhaust yourself in a lifetime of permanent tantalization and attempts for satisfaction which simply nullify. That is why the problems of liberalism have resulted in a sense of normless enemy, like they've deadened the nerve of life itself. Why are more people not outraged about the cult, and it is a cult, the sacramental cult, the inverted sacrament of child sacrifice? Why do people not see that? People who talk about atrocities, they never talk about that one, do they? That is because the nerve is dead. It has become insensate. It has been oversaturated by stimulation and self-influence. If you, unfortunately, read the works of the Marquis de Sade, which I have, because I always like to find things out, you'll find that they're tedious. They're not salaciously fascinating. Unlike the video representation of Harry Rush, whispering excitedly through the walls of the Bastille to people with a rapt audience. It is simply a shopping list of ever-increasing depravity and demonstrates the jaded appetites of perpetual indulgence. Nothing moves you anymore. Not pain, not pleasure, not misery, not woe, not joy, not beauty, nothing. It kills you inside. This is one of the reasons why people are so amenable nowadays to being repatterned by algorithms on social media, which were designed, in effect, by the United States deep state. The Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency ran a project called LifeLog, which was cancelled on the same day that Facebook was launched. Look it up. The former director of the program of LifeLog admitted in an interview in 2014, I believe, that LifeLog was Facebook. It was the United States Secret State National Security Agency's mass surveillance attempt that was launched under the Total Information Awareness Program following the attacks on September the 11th. There was outrage in Congress, outrage in the Senate, and it was stopped. So they renamed it the Terrorist Information Awareness Program. That didn't work. So they cancelled it, and then they relaunched it as Facebook. So instead of monitoring you against your will, they created models where you would volunteer all of your own personal data. And that is the world we live in now. The reason why there is relative free speech upon Twitter is because I believe Elon Musk is building a better input for his large language learning model, artificial intelligence, right? That means he wants a broader range of human input. All of these platforms are creating algorithms that can predict human behavior with enormous accuracy. And the news that you see and the images that you're fed with and the opinions that are manufactured for you are shaped according to these preferences, which is a form of feedback between you and a machine. So human beings are increasingly patterned upon machines, upon, as it were, the thoughts of a computer, and not on the family, and not on reality, and not on the ultimate reality, which is God. This is the reason why it seems appealing to them in a normless world with no direction and no moral value and no significance for the self. This is why it's appealing to them to be seduced by the idea of some great eschatological wonder worked by technology, that there will be an afterworld. Every revolution promises an afterworld. Every revolution promises a great after time when all will be fed, and the poet has more verses, and the toothless have teeth, and the hungry have more soup, and it will be wonderful. Some kind of Panglossian paradise. But the trouble with utopia is that you have to swim across a sea of blood to get there, and you never arrive. That is the lesson of history. As people have said to me when they've tried to bring out apologetics to the unbelieving, I've said to them, I don't really bother with much of that, mainly because I'm not very good at theology, right? But there's another reason as well, because I like to try and come out with a zinger, yeah? I'm a little man, so when I fight, I've got to hurt you. I've got to put you down fast because you're going to fill me in, otherwise, yeah? I have been filled in a lot, probably because I go on too much. So this knockout punch that I've delivered is this. It's basically a variation on credo qui absurdum est. It's that the belief in man is far more absurd than the belief in God. Just look at his track record. That tends to shut them up, and then you can see them thinking about whether or not it's a good idea to actually, chin me. And once they see me teeth, they think, hey, he's had a few of them. Yeah, maybe not, maybe not. I don't mind being chinned anymore. But the point that I'm trying to make is that there is a choice now between a fantasy ideology that's collapsing and the reality that it has attempted to deny and whose morality it's tried to invert. It doesn't have any wider moral framework, and it is completely corrupt and bankrupt from the top down. Why are they anti-natalist? I'll tell you why they're anti-natalist, because to these people, humanity is a management problem to solve. That's it. There's no further dimension to you. There's no greater meaning to life. Humanity is a management problem to solve. The reason why I mentioned the project of regime change is because when it started to produce mass population transfers, that's when you started to hear that borderlessness was a good thing. There's a reason why they're never going to answer that question. That it's not just because they won't admit they've done it themselves and they don't have a solution to it. It's also that the economic model is based upon more consumers. And neoliberal economics just means the line of GDP must go up. We have consumer economies. All they want is more consumers. They don't care what they're consuming or where they come from or who they are. And from the management point of view, there's an infinite supply of willing consumers to be introduced into every consumer nation. And that is the reason why this project continues regardless of political change. Well, there's no real political change. Because the economic model necessitates national cultural suicide. The anti-natalism is itself fostered by the consumer idea, because the more that you retreat into the mad cult of the self, the more that you see life as simply an exploration in the permanent tantalization and satisfaction of your desires, well, you begin to think that perhaps I shouldn't have children because now I can't play any video games. Maybe I can't go on holiday, or this is the reason why. I mean, to be honest, there is some justification for that, because the difficulty I encounter in finding a pair of socks is enormous, right? And that was a major problem in my life this morning, and a pen, because my hats, because my children run away with everything, right, and permanently sabotage me. But the point is that if you collapse the dimension of life to the self and the satisfaction of its desires, which are promoted by a technologically advanced machine, propaganda that was invented just over 100 years ago, that's become increasingly refined by technique. Technique in the technological society is the reproduction of a standard result. And you must understand that the vast mass culture that we inhabit is constantly refining, not just through algorithms, its techniques of shaping your view of reality. And it is guiding people towards an exclusive concentration on the satisfaction of their own personal desires, where it sees things like duty, love, faith, everything that gives life meaning as an encumbrance or a restraint to be removed. I think my time is up. Is that it? Should I shut up now? Where's oh, all right, okay. I mean, it's remarkable to note that if you care about it, that in the beginning of the Enlightenment, where these ideas come from, people like Rousseau, do you remember Rousseau? Rousseau, man is born free, but everywhere he's in chains. This is the beginning of the idea of negative liberty, that we must liberate ourselves from these constraints, these moral, religious, cultural constraints that are somehow vanquishing the human spirit that needs to be free. Rousseau donated all of his children to an orphanage. He abandoned them all, didn't even see them, never knew them. He even wrote a book about how to look after your children, and called Emile about school, and people celebrate that. But they never mention the fact that the man who talked about the basis of liberty being the satisfaction of personal desire through the removal of all cultural, moral, traditional, religious restraint, himself had no regard for his own children and simply threw them away. That's the beginning of the liberal idea. That is the beginning of the Enlightenment reason. Most of these men were childless, yeah, and when they did have children, they didn't care for them. Of course, Marx himself is a terrible father. But the idea that it's merely cultural Marxism is a limited understanding, because as I've said, it's the confluence of technology and consumerism that has produced this situation where we're in now. And to go back to the idea of liberalism, it is important to stress that the reason why we are going to win is that the enemy may seem powerful and strong in the control of an unchallengeably invincible global empire. It is falling apart before your very eyes. One of the main foundations of the liberal idea, that the idea of liberalism changed, and the one that we have now is the liberalism from the fall of the Soviet Union. It was the idea that it was what was called value pluralist. That was Berlin's great defense. The greatest champion of liberalism ever to live was a Russian Jew who lived in Britain called Sir Isaiah Berlin. He was a magnificent thinker, right? I like him a lot. As he said about somebody else that I liked, bit of Nazi, a wonderful book. He said that about Wyndham Lewis's book. It is a good book, yeah? But I would say this about Isaiah Berlin in his voice. Well, very much liberal, which is brilliant. He is, he's no better man on liberalism. He said that what makes liberalism liberal is the tolerance of plural values. We no longer inhabit a world of the tolerance of plural values. The argument of liberalism that it was better than the Soviet Union was that it tolerated its opposite within its own society. It no longer does that now. The chauvinism's come home. The techniques of regime change have come home. Economic sanctions are applied to journalists who dissent from the empire's narrative. They are destroyed, their lives are ruined. The cancel culture is coming home and it's cancelling all of our culture. And not only that, the limits of liberalism have been demonstrated in Sweden last week when the Prime Minister gave an interview saying that Swedish law was not made for child soldiers, for explosions, and for violent gangs. And they're bringing the army back on the streets. So liberalism always disavowed the use of force. Hard power has come back to the world's most liberal nation. And the simple fact is, as John Gray said last week in a lecture, he is probably the greatest living philosopher in the English language, and again, a very good critic of liberalism, and I'd encourage you to read him. He said that the legitimacy of states does not simply rely on the consent that you give, the presumed consent of the vote. Legitimacy also relies on the basic guarantees of the state. The state monopolizes violence in order to prevent you from it. It's supposed to be able to secure you and to promise some basic prosperity. And it should have some degree of trust, or not complete distrust like it has now. Our states are no longer legitimate. They cannot protect you. They cannot shut the door. And their economic model relies not only on the extirpation of your national life, your culture, and your religion, but it also requires an addiction to a war economy that will bring us into a perpetual and universal state of barbarism. So the war on the family is not just about Catholic families. The war on the family is about families everywhere. The war on the family is about the fact that we live in a criminal, corrupt system that has been utterly compromised and has betrayed its own values, that does not, by its own definition, practice the tolerance that was at the heart of liberalism in its value pluralism. It no longer does this. It no longer has any legitimacy to govern. And as you can see from the answer to crime being the decriminalization of crime on a large scale, it no longer has the power to enforce its own laws. And the world's most liberal nation has resorted to the military. The war on the family will come to an end. We are going to win because the enemy is literally committing suicide by addiction to a dangerous fantasy inspired by the cult of the self, which is the literal work of Satan. Thank you. Sorry for going on.